For the general public, academic discourse is dreadfully dry. It sorely lacks the visceral thrill of an Eastern wuxia duel or the romantic finality of a Western knight's joust. Yet, if economists were to enter a physical ring to settle their scores, the spectacle would be glorious. A clash of epic proportions that might have tempted Homer to pen a third volume, immortalizing tweed-jacketed professors as bronze-clad heroes trading blows upon the windy plains of academia. Confrontation is not merely a guilty pleasure for the masses. Economists themselves find it equally irresistible. In 1974, Friedrich August von Hayek shared the Nobel Prize in Economics with the Karl Gunnar Myrdal, a shotgun marriage of intellectual opposites if ever there was one. By 1978, Hayek was staring down his 80th year. At the time, the West was choked by stagflation, while Leonid Brezhnev's Soviet Union was sinking into the slow-motion decay of its late stagnation period, a regime that was a whited sepulcher, all spit and polish on the outside, but pure rot within. The core dispute, whether command economy or the free market allocates resources with greater efficiency, remained stubbornly deadlocked. Thus, Hayek resolved to hold a grand final showdown in Paris, then the intellectual fortress of Western Europe's left. The proposed motion for this ultimate duel was as blunt as it was provocative. Is socialism a mistake? A mandarin's mutiny never bears fruit in 3 years, goes the old Chinese proverb, popularized by the late Qing novelist Li Baojia. For the armchair revolutionary, this vastly overestimates the revolutionary stomach of the literati. Had he suggested 3 millennia, he might have been closer to the mark. While Hayek's grand Parisian duel remained a quixotic dream of classical liberal wishful thinking, what the Western intelligentsia failed to pull off in the 20th century, their Chinese counterparts have somehow managed in the 21st. This is China's debate of the century, a titanic, decades-long intellectual sparring match between 2 of the country's most formidable economists, Justin Yifu Lin and Zhang Weiying. Far from a parochial squabble over domestic bookkeeping, their dispute is a high-stakes duel over the ultimate trilemma of the modern age, the fragile, shifting equilibrium between the individual, the market, and the state. It is, in essence, a battle for the soul of development economics. The only pity is the deafening silence from the global gallery, a symptom of a polite but pervasive academic provincialism in the West that treats non-Western debates as mere regional curiosities. Yet this clash of minds is nothing less than a foundational blueprint for how humanity might construct a pragmatic, affordable bridge between grim realities and lofty aspirations. To appreciate the gravity of this contest, one must first meet the 2 pioneers who drew the battle lines. When the weather is dry, tempers flare. At Peking University, China's premier academic sanctuary, the elemental heat of friction often burns even brighter than at Tsinghua, the other place just across the boundary. Together, these twin titans form a Chinese oxbridge, locked in a perpetual fraternal rivalry where academic pride is a closely guarded monopoly, and where intellectual skirmishes on one side of the fence invariably echo on the other. On a sultry summer afternoon at the turn of the millennium, Professor Hai Wen of PKU's National School of Development was driving through the western side gate of the campus. The security guards, executing their duties with bureaucratic zeal, were inspecting every vehicle, creating a formidable bottleneck at the entrance. Directly ahead of Professor Hai Wen was an MBA student from the rival Guanghua School of Management, who, lacking academic serenity, was relentlessly leaning on his horn. Appalled by this acoustic pollution, Professor Hai stepped out to politely request that the driver cease his auditory assault. The plea fell on deaf ears. Being a scholar of the gentlest pedigree, Professor Hai resorted to his natural weapon, economic theory. He began to lecture the irate motorist on the finer points of negative externalities, meticulously charting how the marginal social cost of his honking vastly exceeded its private utility. This impromptu seminar on vehicular acoustics dragged on, progressing from a mild disagreement to a full-blown debate that lasted from noon until 2 in the afternoon. Had Justin Yifu Lin not driven up to the scene, the two might have remained parked at the gate debating welfare economics for the next 3 years. Justin Yifu Lin was also a scholar, but of a vastly different breed. He was a scholar who had worn a uniform. Stepping out of his car, Lin assessed the situation and promptly joined the fray to reinforce his colleague against the noise polluter. Now outnumbered 2-1 and thoroughly outmatched in both logic and moral authority, the motorist lost his composure. In his desperation, he spat out a line of defiance that seemed directly lifted from a Stephen Chow slapstick comedy. "So what if you're Peking University professors? If you've got the guts, hit me." You may not fear the gods, but you must never provoke a scholar who has served in the army. Taking this bizarre challenge as a formal invitation, Professor Lin, recalling his soldiering days, promptly delivered a swift right hook. The motorist's face instantly blossomed like a sunflower, and the entire academic symposium was swiftly adjourned to the local campus police station. Fan Wenhui, a graduate student who entered the NSD in 2000, later recorded the aftermath.
Years later, Professor Hai would recount the incident with a wry, conspiratorial smile. "I thought about it," he told us, "and managed to restrain myself." But Professor Lin just muttered, "Bloody hell, I've never heard such a masochistic request," and let fly.
这样可以的吧？怎么样呢？我又跳出来了，我又站回去了。哎，怎么样？怎么样？怎么样？我又跳出来了，打我啊，笨蛋！就打你！
大家都听到了，是他叫我打我才打的。
像这种要求，我这辈子都没见过。
The economics of personal finance among aspiring Chinese scholars was, in those early days of reform, a highly precarious business. Take Fan Wenhui, whom we met just now. When the time came to apply for postgraduate studies abroad, Fan Wenhui found himself unable to scrape together even the few hundred yuan required for the application fees. In desperation, he turned to his professor, Justin Yifu Lin, who, with military-style dispatch, told him to simply drop by his house and help himself to the cash. This act of quiet patronage is frequently conflated in campus folklore with another legendary act of academic lending at Peking University's National School of Development, one involving Lin's chief intellectual rival and a rather more substantial sum of money. Zhang Weiying hails from Wubu, a county in the rugged, dust-blown northern province of Shaanxi. He represents the alternative pole of China's economic soul. When the Gaokao, the National University Entrance Examination, was miraculously resurrected in 1977 after the dark, decade-long hiatus of the Cultural Revolution, Zhang's name was missing from the initial ledger of the saved. Due to a bureaucratic cocktail of age limits and rigid local quotas, he was rejected in the first round. Resigned to his fate, he prepared to return to the Shaanxi soil to repair the earth, the delightfully poetic euphemism of the era for back-breaking agricultural labor. However, fortune always favors the gifted. The central government realized that a shortage of talent would determine the success or failure of the reforms, and so decided to expand enrollment as a matter of urgency that year. At Northwest University in Xi'an, the legendary professor He Liancheng decided on a whim to establish a brand new department of political economy. So, a delegation of 8 veteran admissions professors, affectionately dubbed the 8 Great Guardians, descended upon the provincial admissions office. Finding a mountain of rejected humanities applications, they dumped the folders onto the floor and began literally sorting through the discarded papers on hands and knees, looking for overlooked talent. Zhang was among the lucky few salvaged from the linoleum. As he later dryly observed,
If the professor's eyesight had been slightly worse that afternoon, China would have lost an economist and gained one more Shaanxi peasant.
This brings us to the second and much larger of the campus loan legends. Years later, a destitute student from that same impoverished northern province of Shaanxi arrived at Peking University. He had passed the grueling entrance exams, but was utterly unable to afford the tuition. He knocked on Professor Zhang's door, who by then was an established academic heavyweight. Confronted by this completely unfamiliar young compatriot, Zhang did not offer a lecture on the virtues of balanced budgets or personal thrift. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a thick envelope containing 20,000 yuan, a small fortune in literary royalties he had just received. Slapping the envelope onto the desk with the blunt, uncompromising hospitality characteristic of Shaanxi men, Zhang barked in his thick, unvarnished northwestern accent.
I've just been paid this 20,000. Take it. If it's not enough, you'll have to figure the rest out yourself.
Around the turn of the millennium, a sum of 20,000 yuan was a small fortune for a student from the Chinese countryside, the kind of capital that did not merely lubricate financial friction, but fundamentally altered the trajectory of a life. As a quintessential son of the Chinese Northwest, Zhang Weiying had built a formidable reputation at Peking University for being blunt to a fault, utterly indifferent to administrative toes he might step on, and fiercely pragmatic. He had no time for the cheap currency of verbal sympathy. To him, the only meaningful empathy was a swift, liquid, and entirely unbureaucratic injection of capital. The institutional home for this pragmatic brand of scholarship was the China Center for Economic Research, the celebrated predecessor to Peking University's National School of Development. The CCER was not built by a faceless state committee, but by a band of returning academic rebels. Alongside the 3 figures we have already met, Justin Yifu Lin, Zhang Weiying, and Hai Wen, the founding pantheon included Yi Gang, Zhang Fan, and Yu Mingde. Together, these 6 returnees from Western universities embarked on a mission to drag Chinese economic policy into the 20th and subsequently 21st century. To protect their intellectual sovereignty, these founders built a rare oasis of academic self-governance. The NSD stands as China's only true experiment in professor-led governance. Within its walls, administrative dictates from the university bureaucracy carry little weight. Every strategic decision, from major structural changes to the hiring of new faculty, must be scrutinized, debated, and put to a vote by the General Assembly of full professors. Crucially, the recruitment of any new academic requires unanimous consent. A single dissenting vote from a tenured peer acts as an absolute, insurmountable veto, a modern academic equivalent of the old English club blackball.
所谓语言腐败是什么呢？就是人们为了政治或者意识形态的目的，偷换语言的概念。
In 1997, Zhang Weiying shifted his base of operations to Peking University's Guanghua School of Management. By January 1999, he was installed as the first associate dean, running the day-to-day affairs with characteristic decisiveness. From 2006 to 2010, he reigned as dean. During this turbulent decade, Zhang wielded his administrative scalpel with terrifying enthusiasm. His pièce de résistance was the Guiwei Reformation of 2003, a personnel overhaul that remains one of the most polarizing and disruptive structural earthquakes in the history of Chinese higher education. The reforms, launched in the lunar year of Guiwei, 2003, sought to demolish the cozy feudal assumptions of Chinese academic life. Zhang introduced 3 radical heresies: a strict ban on academic inbreeding, preventing universities from hiring their own postgraduates; the ruthless Anglo-American doctrine of up or out, Cravath system; and a formalized tenure track system. Naturally, the academic establishment, accustomed to a monastic existence of lifetime tenure and intellectual nepotism, reacted with outraged horror. Yet, while the initial onslaught met with fierce resistance and required messy administrative compromises, the core logic of Zhang's coup has triumphed. Today, the up or out guillotine and the prohibition against intellectual inbreeding have been quietly adopted by almost every elite double first-class university in China. Yesterday's blasphemy has become today's administrative liturgy. In 2014, as the National School of Development at Peking University celebrated its 20th anniversary, Zhang Weiying decided he had endured enough of the administrative purgatory of the Guanghua School of Management. Running a modern business school in China is less about high economic theory and more about the relentless, exhausting hustle of shaking down wealthy donors for endowments. It was at this very moment that Yao Yang, Dean of Peking University's National School of Development, extended an olive branch to Zhang Weiying, expressing his keen hope that the founder would return. Craving the quiet dignity of a pure, independent academic chair, Zhang sought to return to the NSD, the very house he had helped build. Yet, as we have established, the NSD remains a stubborn oasis of professor-led democracy. Even a founding father returning from administrative exile must submit to the academic equivalent of a grand jury. At the formal hearing, Zhang laid out his latest treatises. While most faculty members offered only polite, perfunctory inquiries, the session quickly dissolved into a private, high-stakes duel. Justin Yifu Lin stepped into the arena, unleashing a barrage of forensic, highly charged questions. The air in the room grew heavy with intellectual gunpowder. When the interrogation finally concluded, Zhang was ushered out so his peers could debate his fate behind locked doors. It was here that the true character of academic rivalry revealed itself. Lin, having just spent hours trying to dissect his opponent on the stand, stood up and declared with absolute soldierly finality,
"The National School of Development needs Zhang Weiying. He must return."
The resulting ballot was a flawless, unanimous verdict. The prodigal co-founder was welcomed home with 100% of the vote. Though Lin and Zhang walked fundamentally different intellectual paths, they remained exemplars of a vanishing breed, the gentleman scholar. They were simultaneously comrades in arms and lifelong sparring partners, bound by a warm, private friendship that transcended their ideological schisms. At the time, Lin held the exalted, if largely ceremonial, title of Honorary Dean at the National School of Development, while the active directorship of the school had passed to his former student, Yao Yang. Yao, a shrewd academic administrator, invoked Peking University's finest traditions, an elegant ethos of all-embracing liberalism, and the classic Confucian ideal of harmony without uniformity. Around 2014, rather than attempting to quiet the brewing storm, Yao proactively constructed a bespoke think tank platform specifically designed to host the great debate over industrial policy. It was a masterstroke of academic theater, transforming what could have been a bitter backroom feud into a magnificent public feast of ideas that would captivate the nation's entire economic establishment. While the physical or intellectual cut and thrust of a duel is always immensely entertaining, there remains a vast gulf between those who merely enjoy the theater and those who appreciate the fencing. As the Chinese proverb goes, the layperson cheers the noise, but the connoisseur studies the craft. Before we pull up our ringside chairs to dissect the battle across the centuries, a brief exhortation to the gallery of gentlemen spectators is in order. To truly comprehend the stakes, one must arm oneself with the principle of value neutrality, Wertfreiheit, as the German sociologist Max Weber so dryly coined it. Weber insisted that a true scholar, whether on the lecture podium or in the research lab, must maintain an austere, almost monastic detachment. One's personal political dogmas, religious creeds, or commercial self-interest must be checked at the cloakroom of intellectual inquiry, ensuring that research remains entirely insulated from the corrupting influence of external agendas. The alternative is intellectual bankruptcy. Preconceived alliances inevitably shackle the intellect. If we judge an argument not by its empirical validity, but merely by whether the speaker belongs to our tribe, we doom ourselves to cognitive blindness. We will gloss over inconvenient truths, distort plain facts, and fail entirely to grasp the elegant internal logic of opposing views. Deprived of this objectivity, the spectator ceases to be an independent mind and descends instead into Gustave Le Bon's mindless herd, cheering or booing on cue, opposing for the sole sake of opposition, and supporting for the sole sake of support. On the surface, the intellectual dividing lines of China's great macroeconomic duel are deceptively clear. Justin Yifu Lin champions his new structural economics, a marriage of efficient markets and an enabling state. By contrast, Zhang Weiying clings with Oxford-bred tenacity to the Austrian school, preaching the pure creed of free markets and the rule of law. Lest the casual observer mistake this for a clash between a planned economy and a market economy, it is worth noting their shared temple. Both men are devout disciples of the market. Both view private property rights as the indispensable engine of economic life. The fracture occurs not at the starting line, but at the role of the state. The central question is one of governmental duty. Is the sovereign's job merely to sweep the playing field and enforce contracts through the rule of law, or should it actively build the stadium and pick the winners through industrial policy? During their academic skirmishes, Zhang has frequently accused Lin's new structural economics of being a Trojan horse for old, planned economy dogmas. Lin, understandably, recoils at the charge. To accuse a Chicago-trained economist of being a closet Soviet planner is a bit like accusing a bishop of secretly practicing paganism. To prevent this debate from degenerating into lazy, politically charged mudslinging, we must abandon the nebulous shorthand of the planned economy and employ a far more precise academic taxonomy: the command economy, Befehlswirtschaft. A true command economy is defined not by mere state intervention, but by totalizing control across three distinct dimensions.
State-dictated production. The state owns the means of production. It decides what is made, in what quantities, and by whom. Private enterprise is not merely discouraged, it is illegal. Administered pricing. Price tags are bureaucratic decrees, frozen in place by planning committees and entirely insulated from the vulgar fluctuations of supply and demand. The regimentation of life. Daily existence is a tightly rationed affair. Citizens obtain bread, coal, and boots through state coupons. The sovereign decides where you study, where you work, and, ultimately, how you live.
By this strict definition, Lin's facilitating state is a far cry from the heavy-handed ghost of the Soviet Gosplan. He does not wish to own the bakeries or freeze the price of bread. Rather, he wants the state to build the highway so the bakers can deliver their goods to a competitive market. Yet, to Zhang, even a state that merely facilitates is playing a dangerous game of pretend. In the Austrian view, a government that attempts to guide industrial development is still guilty of the fatal conceit, the belief that a group of planners, no matter how well-intentioned, can outsmart the spontaneous order of millions of free individuals. Cognition is a terribly delicate instrument. Years ago, when I was apprenticed to a master to study photography, during a discussion in photography under Li Shaobai, celebrated as the definitive visual chronicler of the Forbidden City, my master offered a piece of quiet wisdom.
Photography is never an art, but there are elements of art within photography.
The same exquisite distinction must be applied to Justin Yifu Lin's new structural economics. It is certainly not a command economy. To call it such would be intellectually lazy. Yet, we must ask the more uncomfortable surgical question: does it nonetheless harbor the phantom DNA of command economy thinking? Because this Lin-Zhang contest is of such monumental consequence, it demands nothing less than a prolonged surgical dissection. We shall spare no ink, and we shall certainly not rush the autopsy. Before we unsheathe the scalpel, however, it is only civilized to allow the gallery a brief intermission. Settle back, pour yourself a stiff drink, and perhaps adjust your opera glasses. Settle into the gallery stalls with your choice of ringside provisions, be they roasted peanuts or a quiet gin and tonic, for the spectacle ahead promises to be intellectually bloody. But before we make the first incision into the battle across the centuries, we must tie up the loose ends of that unfinished 20th century joust in the West. What then became of Hayek's grand, aborted Parisian duel? Let us return to the duel that never was, Hayek's aborted Parisian debate. Today, the historical record of this event is badly choked by ideological exhaust fumes, with internet fables running wild. In a delicious irony, the worst offenders are often the self-proclaimed standard-bearers of the Austrian school itself. Lacking any real grasp of Austrian economic methodology, these disciples have transformed a rigorous intellectual framework into a crude ideological banner. In doing so, they have fabricated tales that do their own beloved school a grave disservice. Consider the fantastical claims currently circulating in the more feverish corners of the web. The legend. A chivalric, gauntlet-throwing Friedrich Hayek supposedly issued a formal declaration of war directly to the Kremlin, challenging Soviet economists to a public intellectual duel to the death. When Hayek set up his scholastic boxing ring, we are told, the terrified planners of Moscow fled, and not a single Marxist dared to step into the arena. The reality. The so-called Paris Challenge, while a fascinating intellectual concept, never actually took place. It was never formally issued as a public challenge, and it was certainly never boycotted by trembling Soviet academics. The only public account of this proposed Paris Challenge comes from the diaries and notes of his editor, William Warren Bartley III. Hayek himself remained remarkably silent on the matter, never once boasting of it in public. Moreover, by the late 1970s, the grim reality of Hayek's physical condition was a far cry from the image of an energetic academic street fighter. His health was in catastrophic decline. He was simply incapable of producing a sustained, complex treatise on his own. Enter Bartley. Far from a mere proofreader, the American philosopher served as Hayek's ultimate intellectual ventriloquist. Bartley took a chaotic jumble of Hayek's messy drafts, cryptic index cards, and fragments of old essays, and subjected them to a brutal, creative reconstruction. The notes prepared for this aborted duel would eventually form the basis of his final book, The Fatal Conceit. but the resulting volume was largely ghostwritten, a work of heavy-handed editorial assembly published under the fading master's name. Yet, academic myths, like bad currency, are eventually driven out of circulation by rigorous scholarship. The doctrinaire fanboys of the Austrian school, who treat Hayek's final years as a series of flawless, heroic triumphs, have long been corrected by the very gatekeepers of Hayek's own estate. Enter Bruce J. Caldwell, the general editor of the collected works of F.A. Hayek and the undisputed high priest of Austrian school historiography. Refusing to settle for internet folklore, Caldwell embarked on a piece of literal unboxing at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Descending into the physical archives of Hayek's late-life papers, Caldwell performed a brilliant piece of scholastic detective work. In his authoritative 2004 volume, Hayek's Challenge, he laid the evidence bare, publishing first-hand archival documents that proved the Paris Challenge was far from a figment of a feverish imagination. There, in Hayek's own hand, was the blueprint for a grand intellectual crusade. A carefully drafted roster of 12 classical liberal gladiators, complete with a complex, multi-day set of debate rules. The octogenarian had indeed drawn up the battle lines. Yet if the intent to fight was real, the book that eventually emerged from those battle notes remains a highly problematic intellectual changeling. Caldwell, alongside the political theorist Jeffrey Friedman and the biographer Alan Ebenstein, arrived at a sobering consensus. The Fatal Conceit was less a book written by Hayek himself and more an elaborate expansion project by his editor, William Warren Bartley III. Bartley had taken the raw, skeletal outlines and rough notes prepared for the Paris debate, materials Hayek himself had never intended for the printing press, and inflated them into a full-length treatise using his own linguistic style. The late Jeffrey Friedman was particularly scathing on this point. He argued that the Fatal Conceit cannot, in any strict academic sense, be taken as an authentic representation of Hayek's true thought. The prose, and indeed some of the book's central, most aggressive evolutionary arguments, bore the unmistakable, heavy-handed imprint of Bartley's personal philosophy, rather than the nuanced, cautious skepticism of the classical liberal master. Why then have we taken this forensic detour into the twilight of Hayek's career and the dubious, ghost-written provenance of his final testament? This exercise is not merely one of academic pedantry. It serves, first and foremost, as a stark reminder of a sobering truth. Value neutrality is an exceedingly rare and fragile commodity. Whether on the left or the right, and regardless of the economic church to which they pledge allegiance, partisans are perpetually tempted to tailor the facts to fit their ideological suits. When history does not provide the clean-cut, heroic triumphs their dogmas demand, they are only too happy to invent them. Yet these satisfying, chest-thumping legends, while immensely gratifying to the converted, do absolutely nothing to advance the sober cause of economic science. On the contrary, they merely fortify tribal divisions, transforming what should be dynamic, exploring ideas into heavy iron shackles that bind the intellect.
For minds already locked in the sensory deprivation chamber of pure ideology, debate ceases to be a search for truth.
This brings us to a second, more uncomfortable realization. While rigorous debate is the ultimate catalyst for human thought, it is entirely wasted on minds that have already surrendered to dogma. For those shackled by preconceived positions, any public confrontation ceases to be a genuine exchange of ideas. Instead, it degenerates into a tedious exercise in one-motion, separate soliloquies. It becomes a theater of the deaf, where each side merely projects its own pre-packaged illusions onto the same stage, utterly immune to the inconvenient intrusions of reality. Should you find yourself itching to join this scholastic gladiatorial arena, do not remain a mere silent observer in the gallery. The lists are open. We invite you to cast your own gauntlet into the ring by leaving your thoughts in the comments section below, or by dispatching an email to lodge your intellectual petition. In our next installment, the pleasantries will conclude, the seconds will step aside, and we shall finally raise the curtain on this historic duel. Prepare yourselves. The clash of the titans is about to begin.